Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Facts channel. Tonight we're stepping back into a world of stone and shadow, a world of medieval castles. These vast structures rose above the land not simply as places to live, but as declarations. Every battlement, every gate, every tower told a story about who held power and who did not. A castle could silence a road. It could hold a kingdom together or pull one apart. Behind those thick walls were people cooking and praying and arguing and waiting, soldiers who grew bored between dangers, lords who calculated every alliance, servants who kept everything running without ever being remembered. The more you look at a medieval castle, the more human it becomes, not a fairy tale but a machine for control, for endurance, for making authority feel permanent in a world that changed without warning. If these quiet journeys through history bring you some peace, I would love it if you liked or subscribed, or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too. But for now, there is nothing you need to do except settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow down just a little. And as the evening deepens around you, come with me into the world of medieval castles. Let us begin. A castle was never just a building. Before it was a home or a prison or a great hall ringing with voices, it was a message written in stone. The message was simple. Someone powerful lives here. Someone with the resources to raise walls this thick, towers this tall, gates this heavy. And if you were a farmer watching that structure go up on the hill above your village, the message was impossible to ignore. Castles were built to be seen. They occupied heights and river bends and road crossings not by accident but by calculation. The landscape was read like a map of influence, and the castle was placed where that influence could reach the furthest. Inside, people certainly slept and ate and argued and made decisions, but the building itself was always doing something. Even when empty, a castle worked. It reminded everyone within sight of it that authority had taken a permanent form. Stone does not pack up and leave. That permanence was the whole point. Building a castle could ruin a lord who underestimated the cost. Stone had to come from somewhere. Quarrymen cut it, carters hauled it, masons shaped it, labourers lifted it into place on scaffolding made of timber that itself required felling and transport and skilled carpentry. Lime had to be burned for mortar. Iron workers made the fittings, the hinges, the clamps, the locks. Every trade needed feeding. Every worker needed paying. And when the walls were finally up, the cost did not stop. Rain and frost cracked mortar. Roofs leaked. Gates wore loose. A castle was a permanent commitment, not a single project. Some lords began grander than their purses could support and built in stages across decades, stopping when money failed and resuming when it returned. Their walls are uneven, not from poor planning, but from the reality of medieval finance. A great castle was proof of ambition. A finished one was proof of survival. Water could decide a siege before a single weapon was raised. Deep inside the walls of many fortresses, cut through stone at enormous effort, sat a well. It was not dramatic to look at. It was dark and narrow and easily overlooked by visitors admiring the towers above. But in a siege, that well was everything. An enemy could burn fields and block roads and starve a garrison of news and reinforcements. But if the well held clean water, the defenders held time, and time in a siege was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Digging such a well was brutal work. Men descended into tightening shafts and cut through rock with iron tools and hauled rubble up in baskets hand over hand. Some wells went deeper into the earth than the tallest tower rose above it. That inversion is worth sitting with. The most important structure in the fortress was the one you could not see. Hidden beneath the courtyard, patient and dark, keeping the whole stone world above it alive. Position mattered more than almost any other decision a castle builder could make. A fortress placed well could control movement across an entire region without needing a large garrison. A bridge, a mountain pass, a coastal inlet, a river ford. These were the bottlenecks of the medieval world, and a castle commanding one of them commanded far more than its own walls. Merchants paid tolls. Armies had to choose between a costly attack and a long detour. Messengers could be inspected. Rebellions could be detected before they gathered momentum. The castle did not need to pursue power. Power flowed toward it along the roads and rivers that had no other crossing. This is why some of the most modest fortresses in terms of size left enormous marks on history. They were not the grandest. They were simply the most precisely placed. The landscape did half the work and the builders were wise enough to let it. Approaching a castle was designed to make you feel exposed. The path narrowed, the walls climbed, the towers watched from angles that removed any sense of safety. Before a visitor had spoken a word or been challenged by a guard, the architecture had already begun working on them. This was intentional. Castle designers understood that fear and hesitation were allies. An attacker pausing at the gate to look up at the heights was already losing confidence. A visiting noble being escorted through a sequence of narrowing courts and rising walls was already being shown who held the advantage. The entrance was never simply a door. It was a demonstration. The great gatehouse with its multiple barriers, its overhead openings, its flanking towers, its angled approach was the castle distilled to its purest argument. Entry was permitted, but it was never comfortable. And that discomfort was the message the building most wanted to deliver. The most effective sieges were often not fought at all. They were waited. An army that surrounded a castle and simply remained there was deploying patience as a weapon. The defenders had walls and height and stored supplies, but the besieging force had something the garrison could not manufacture: time. Inside the walls, every sack of grain counted, every barrel of salted meat was measured against the unknown length of the siege. Horses consumed precious fodder. Livestock kept for labour became tempting as meat. Crowded conditions spread illness through bodies already weakened by reduced rations. Meanwhile outside, the attackers ate from the surrounding countryside, rested in turns, and did very little except prevent relief from arriving. The mathematics of a siege were brutal. A castle's strength was not in question. Its larder was. When surrender came, it often came not with a crash of broken walls, but with a quiet admission that the last provisions were gone. The most sophisticated castles wrapped their defences in layers. Breaking through the outer wall did not mean victory, it meant entering a trap. The attackers who fought their way past the first barrier found themselves in an exposed space with a higher inner wall above them, and defenders able to fire from both sides. They had spent blood and effort to gain ground that was still hostile in every direction. This concentric design reached its fullest expression in the great Crusader fortresses and in the Welsh castles of Edward I. The principle was elegant in its cruelty. Every apparent victory revealed a deeper problem. Every breakthrough became a new enclosure. An attacker inside a concentric castle was not winning, he was being absorbed. The design turned space itself into a weapon, layering danger inward until there was nowhere safe to stand. Geography was the first wall a castle builder raised. Before a single stone was cut, the wisest builders were reading the land. A steep slope exhausted attackers before they reached the gate. A cliff face removed the need for walls on one side entirely. Marshy ground slowed heavy siege equipment to a crawl. A river provided supply and communication while limiting approach to predictable angles. The best sites turned nature into architecture. They made enemies solve the terrain before they could address the masonry. A badly chosen site required endless building to compensate for what the landscape failed to provide. A brilliant site made a smaller and cheaper fortress, formidable against forces 3 times its equal. Medieval builders were not simply stacking stones. They were reading slopes and sight lines and watercourses and wind direction. The fortress began not with a foundation, but with an observation. The castle that stands on the right rock does not need to be the tallest. It only needs to let the hill do what stone alone cannot. The great siege engines were as much psychological weapons as physical ones. Imagine watching a trebuchet being assembled outside the walls of your fortress. The timber arms rising, the counterweight hanging, the crews working in organised silence. Before it launched a single stone, you already knew what was coming, and that knowledge was part of what it was designed to do. The machines threw heavy stones in a rhythm that wore on the nerves as much as the masonry. They could also throw other things: rotting animal carcasses to spread disease and despair, firepots to threaten stores and roofs, messages intended to fracture the loyalty of the garrison. Building one of these engines required skilled carpenters and rope makers and ironworkers, and a commander who understood mathematics well enough to adjust range and trajectory. They were not crude devices. They were elaborate announcements of intent. Every launch said the same thing to the people behind the walls: we have time, resources, and patience, and we're not going anywhere. Castles did not only dominate the land, they grew towns from it. A fortress offered something, Medieval people needed desperately. A sense of order in a dangerous world. Where there was a castle, there was a garrison. Where there was a garrison, there were customers. Craftsmen set up workshops near the walls. Farmers brought produce to sell. Travellers stopped where guards and gates made the night feel safer. Over generations, these gatherings became streets and markets and parishes with their own identities quite separate from the fortress above. The castle shaped them without intending to. Its hunger for supplies and labour and services pulled communities into its orbit. The relationship was not always easy. Lords collected dues and controlled rights and sometimes demanded labour. But the protection was real, and the pull was powerful. Many towns in England and France and across Europe owe their original existence to a fortress that needed feeding. The castle was the seed, and the town grew in its shadow whether the shadow was warm or cold. The earliest castles in Europe were not stone at all. They were earth and timber, a raised mound of packed soil called a motte, with a wooden tower or enclosure on top and a lower yard called a bailey below, defended by a ditch and a timber fence. The design was not beautiful. It was fast. A lord who needed to stamp control onto newly taken land could not wait years for masonry. He needed something defensible by next week. The motte and bailey provided it. Ditches were dug. The excavated earth was piled into a mound. Timber was cut and shaped and raised into walls and towers. A small determined force could command a hill, a road, a river crossing within days. These early fortresses spread across medieval Europe with remarkable speed precisely because speed was their entire advantage. They burned and rotted and disappeared. But many stone castles rose on the same sites, their masonry foundations sinking through the earth of the older mound below. The great stone towers began in wood. Windsor Castle began not as a royal palace but as a military grip on a river. After the Norman conquest of England, William needed strong points fast, and Windsor sat where the Thames made a natural barrier, and London lay within reach. The early castle was rough and urgent, a timber fortification on a raised earthwork serving a kingdom that had just been violently reorganised. Over the following centuries it was rebuilt and expanded and refined, until the military origins became almost invisible beneath the ceremonial grandeur. Monarchs added chapels and apartments and towers until the fortress became a palace that still remembered it had once been a garrison. That memory matters. Windsor's extraordinary continuity across nearly 1,000 years is only possible because it began in the right place for the right reasons. A conqueror's calculation about a river crossing and a road to London became the foundation for everything that followed. The Tower of London was built to be impossible to ignore. Its pale stone rose in a city of timber buildings like a fist above an open hand. William the Conqueror placed it at the edge of London not to protect the city but to remind it who its new rulers were. The message was not subtle. Here is our fortress. Here is our stone. Here is the permanence of our arrival. The white tower that stands at its heart was designed to be seen from the river, from the streets, from the fields beyond the walls, from every direction that mattered. It served as a royal residence, a treasury, an armoury, a prison, and a statement of authority all simultaneously. Later generations added walls and towers and gates, until the complex became a layered fortress of extraordinary depth. But its original purpose was the bluntest possible. It was a castle built to make conquered people feel the weight of what had changed. Caernarfon Castle was built to resemble the walls of Imperial Rome. Edward I did not simply want a fortress in Wales, he wanted a claim. His architects gave the towers polygonal forms and banded the stonework with different coloured stone in deliberate reference to the Roman and Byzantine walls associated with ancient imperial power. This was architecture as political argument. The castle was saying, in stone, that the king who built it stood in a line of authority reaching back through history to the greatest empires the world had known. The site itself carried symbolic weight because Roman remains and Welsh legend both haunted the imagination of the region. Caernarfon was aggressive and theatrical, and unusually self-conscious in its visual ambitions. A visiting dignitary approaching its gates was not just entering a castle. He was being subjected to a lesson about power before he had crossed the threshold. Harlech Castle could be fed from the sea when the land was closed against it. It sat on a rock above the Welsh coast, and when Edward built it, the water came much closer than it does today. A long stairway descended from the castle to a water gate, where ships could unload supplies directly into the fortress, even while a besieging army waited on the landward side. This was strategic thinking at its most elegant. The castle was not simply a defensive shell. It was a node in a wider network of supply and communication that the enemy on land could not sever. Food, soldiers, messages, reinforcements could all arrive by sea, while the besiegers camped outside and watched and waited for a surrender that never came. The sea stair at Harlech is a reminder that medieval castle builders thought not only about resisting attack, but about sustaining life. A fortress that could be fed indefinitely was a fortress that could never be truly trapped. Crac des Chevaliers grew into one of the most formidable fortresses ever built. High in what is now Syria, the Knights Hospitaller expanded an existing stronghold into a layered castle of extraordinary sophistication. Massive outer walls enclosed an inner fortress of even greater strength. Storage halls held provisions for years. Cisterns collected water. Towers commanded every approach. The castle was not simply strong in the way that a thick wall is strong. It was strong in the way that a system is strong, with redundancy built into every layer so that the failure of one element did not expose the whole. The Hospitallers were a military order with the resources and experience to build on a scale that few individual lords could match. The result showed what castle architecture could become when money and knowledge and the constant pressure of real danger were applied without interruption across generations. Crac des Chevaliers is not just a castle. It is a concentrated argument about what defence means. Chateau Gaillard rose above the Seine at extraordinary speed because Richard I demanded it. He needed a fortress to threaten the King of France and guard the approach to Normandy, and he drove the construction forward with an urgency that astonished observers. The castle occupied a high spur above the river, and its design used the natural defences of the promontory as skillfully as any fortress of its age. Richard understood that a castle was a weapon before it was ever attacked. Its presence alone changed what an enemy dared to attempt. The French king looking across the river at those walls had to factor them into every calculation. Richard died before those calculations were fully tested, and the castle eventually fell, which makes it more interesting rather than less. It proves that even the most brilliant fortification depends on the political and human world around it. Stone can outlast a king, but it cannot replace him. Dover Castle stood where England was most vulnerable and most watchful. The shortest crossing between England and the European mainland runs near Dover, and whoever held that height controlled one of the most strategically sensitive points in the kingdom. The castle's great tower, built under Henry II, created a powerful royal presence within a complex that had been fortified since long before the Normans arrived. Around it, earthworks and walls developed across generations into a fortress designed to resist serious attack from a serious enemy arriving by sea. The significance of the site never diminished even as weapons changed and tactics evolved. Geography does not become obsolete. The sea crossing that mattered in the 12th century mattered in the 16th and beyond. Dover is a castle with a single, unchanging purpose stretched across 900 years of English history. Watch the water, hold the cliff, make the crossing cost more than any enemy wants to pay. Edinburgh Castle rises from rock that was ancient before the first human set foot on it. The volcanic plug beneath the fortress was shaped not by human decision, but by forces that operated millions of years before kingdoms existed. Ice scoured its sides, weather deepened its faces. By the time people arrived and began to understand what the rock offered, it had already been a fortress for an eternity. The builders added walls to what the earth had prepared. They did not create the advantage of Edinburgh Castle, they recognised it. The summit commanded the surrounding land in every direction. The slopes were steep enough on three sides to discourage all but the most determined assault. And the view from the top reached far enough to give defenders time to prepare. Human ambition and volcanic geology met on that rock, and the result was one of the most enduring military sites in Europe. When you stand at Edinburgh Castle, you're standing on deep time, and the medieval walls above you are almost the newest thing in sight. Bodiam Castle was built to look like it had always been there. Its wide moat reflects its towers so perfectly that it seems designed as much for the eye as for defence, and in a sense it was. Built in the late medieval period by a man who had made his reputation in war and wanted his home to announce that reputation, Bodiam combined genuine defensive features with a visual language that spoke of ancient authority. The water was real, the towers were real, the approaches were controlled and the battlements were functional, but the overall effect was calculated to impress as powerfully as it was intended to protect. Historians have argued for generations about how battle-ready it truly was. That argument itself is revealing. Bodiam sits at the point where architecture stops being purely practical and becomes also a performance. Its owner wanted to be seen as powerful and permanent, and connected to a long tradition of fortified authority. The castle did not only defend his body, it defended his reputation. Spiral staircases inside towers were built to give defenders a physical advantage. Most climbed clockwise from below. A defender standing above and fighting downward had his sword arm free to swing toward the outer wall where there was room. An attacker climbing upward had his sword arm cramped against the central column where the turn of the stair stole his reach. One man, already exhausted from the climb, already fighting gravity and darkness and fear, found the architecture itself working against his body. The stairs were also narrow enough that attackers could only come one at a time. There was no rushing a defended tower stair in a group. Each man had to face what waited above him alone. Castle builders thought in these terms. They imagined the moments of crisis and shaped stone to favour the people they needed to survive them. A staircase was not simply a way to move between floors. It was a sequence of small decisions about who would have the advantage in the worst possible moment. Murder holes turned the gateway passage into the most dangerous place in the castle. An attacker who had fought through the outer gate and the portcullis and the heavy doors might feel for a moment that the hardest part was behind him. Then the ceiling above him would reveal its purpose. Openings in the vaulted passage allowed defenders positioned safely above to drop stones or pour water or release heated sand that could slip through the gaps in armour and cause terrible pain. The passage could be sealed at both ends, trapping whoever was inside. Defenders working from above were protected and in position. Attackers below were exposed in every direction they could not adequately defend. The genius of this arrangement was that the gateway served two completely opposite purposes simultaneously. In peacetime, it was simply the door through which ordinary life passed. In a siege, it became a trap so carefully designed that forcing it might cost more than the castle was worth to take. Arrow loops gave defenders the ability to fight while almost invisible. From outside a wall, an arrow loop appeared as a thin slit barely wide enough for a hand. From inside, the same opening expanded into a recess where an archer could stand with room to draw a full bow, shift his angle, and cover a wide field of ground through a gap that offered his enemies almost nothing to aim at in return. Some loops were shaped with horizontal extensions at top or bottom to allow shooting at different angles without fully exposing the body. Others were designed to cover dead ground directly below the wall. A castle wall studded with these openings was not passive stone. It was a line of firing positions that kept the people inside nearly invisible, while allowing them to make the ground outside completely unsafe. The silence of a castle wall between exchanges of fire was deceptive. Behind every slit, someone was watching and waiting and ready. The portcullis could seal a gateway in the time it took to cut a rope. Heavy and fitted into grooves cut into the stonework on either side of the passage, it hung above the entrance in a raised position during ordinary times, almost unnoticeable to anyone simply passing through. In an emergency it dropped. The sound of iron or timber striking the ground with that weight behind it must have been final in a way that words struggle to convey. It could trap attackers inside the passage. It could divide a charging group. It could buy defenders the moments they needed to close other barriers or reposition. Raising it again required effort through ropes and pulleys and winches, and that effort was considered worthwhile because gateways were always the weakest point. They had to open for daily life but resist the most violent moments of attack. The portcullis was the mechanical answer to that contradiction. One moment a passage, the next a wall with teeth. Drawbridges were rarer than the stories suggest and more complicated than they looked. The romantic image of a great bridge rising over a water-filled moat on chains is powerful, but it was not the universal feature of medieval castles that popular imagination has made it. Many fortresses used fixed causeways, timber crossings, or carefully angled approaches that forced visitors to expose themselves to flanking fire without any moving bridge at all. A working drawbridge required engineering and maintenance and counterweights, and a setting where the mechanism actually earned its keep. It also had to be protected from being jammed or captured before it could be raised. Medieval builders were practical above everything else. They used a drawbridge when the site called for one and the resources allowed it. They did not use it because a story demanded it. Each castle answered its own specific landscape, its own threat, its own lord's ambitions. The variety is what makes them endlessly interesting. They were not built from a single blueprint. They were each an argument about a particular place. A moat did not need water to do its work. The essential quality of a moat was not its depth or its contents, but its interruption. A ditch forced attackers to descend, cross exposed ground, and climb the other side while defenders above them had all the time and elevation they needed. Whether the ditch held water or mud or sharp timber stakes or simply air was secondary to the fact that it broke the momentum of an assault. Siege equipment could not roll across a trench. Ladders became more complicated to place. Miners had more ground to cover before reaching the foundations. Even a shallow ditch could add enough difficulty to turn a rash attack into a cautious one. And caution gave defenders time. Some moats were shaped so that the wall above them appeared even taller from the bottom than it did from level ground, weaponizing perspective as well as depth. A moat marked the boundary between ordinary land and the space the castle controlled. Crossing it was never meant to feel easy. Castle gates were simultaneously the weakest and the most defended points. Every wall can remain unbroken given enough stone and skill, but a castle must have an entrance. That opening was where daily life flowed through, and it was also where an enemy most urgently wanted to force a way in. Builders answered this problem by turning the entrance into a system rather than a door. The approach might be angled so that attackers had to expose their unshielded sides. Towers flanked the gate and allowed defenders to fire along the face of the wall. Multiple barriers stood in sequence so that breaching one only revealed another. Murder holes and arrow loops covered the passage from above and from the sides. The gatehouse that resulted from this thinking was often the most elaborate and expensive part of the entire castle. It had to bear the greatest symbolic weight too because important visitors arrived there, so the architecture needed to impress as powerfully as it needed to resist. The gate was the castle's contradiction and its masterpiece. A well-designed gatehouse functioned as an independent fortress within the larger one. Its rooms could house guards and officials. Its upper levels provided sleeping chambers for important members of the household. Its internal passages contained their own barriers and firing positions. If the outer castle fell, the gatehouse could continue to resist because it had been designed from the beginning to survive on its own. This made it the most concentrated expression of defensive thinking in the entire site. Every element layered on every other. Multiple portcullises, murder holes, flanking towers, angled approaches, the ability to seal every passage independently. In peacetime, all of this was invisible beneath the ceremony of arrival. Visitors saw authority and grandeur and careful preparation for their comfort. In a siege, the same architecture showed a different face entirely. The gatehouse that had welcomed allies became the structure most likely to frustrate an enemy long after everything else had been taken. Battlements gave the top of every wall a jagged edge that was more than decoration. The raised sections provided cover. The lower gaps allowed observation and fire. A defender on the wall walk could step behind the raised stone, reload, then step into the open gap to shoot and step back again. The rhythm of this movement was what the design made possible. Without the battlements, the wall top would be fully exposed to return fire. With them, defenders could fight at intervals while remaining protected between those moments. Battlements also changed how a castle appeared from a distance. Their notched outline along every roofline communicated readiness even when no one was standing on the wall walk. The shape itself became the message. It meant armed. It meant prepared. It meant occupied by people who expected to need this edge. The silhouette of a battlement was readable from far enough away to matter, and that is exactly how the builders wanted it. Machicolations solved the problem of the ground directly below the wall. A defender standing on the wall walk could see everything in front of him and to the sides, but the base of the wall itself, right below his feet, was hidden. An attacker pressing against the stonework at that point was in the castle's blind spot. Machicolations removed the blind spot. Projecting stone brackets supported a parapet with openings in the floor directly above the most vulnerable sections of wall, and especially above gates. From those openings, defenders could strike straight down at anyone pressing against the base. The engineering required was considerable. The projecting stonework had to bear real weight while leaving those floor gaps in precisely the right positions. But the result gave the castle a terrifying vertical reach. An attacker who had survived everything in front of him might still find danger arriving from directly above. The wall could see its own feet, and what it saw there, it could punish. Round towers replaced square ones because corners were where castles were most vulnerable. A square tower presented its corners to the world, and corners were opportunities. Siege engineers could target them with concentrated impact. Miners could dig beneath them at predictable angles, and when the timber supports inside their tunnels burned, the corner could drop, and the wall with it. Round towers spread the force of impact differently. They gave miners fewer clean angles to exploit. They improved the field of vision for defenders because a curved wall has no blind corner at its base. They also deflected the blows of siege stones more effectively than flat surfaces. The move from square to round towers was not a fashion choice. It was an answer to hard lessons learned in real sieges against real enemies who had already learned to exploit every weakness that earlier builders had left them. Castle architecture was not a tradition handed down unchanged from one generation to the next. It was a conversation between attackers and defenders conducted in stone across centuries. The keep was the last argument a castle could make. When the outer walls were lost and the gatehouse was taken and the courtyard was in enemy hands, the keep still stood. Thicker walls, fewer entrances, higher position within the castle, a defensible stair, a well, stored provisions. The keep was not designed for comfortable living, although some were beautifully fitted with fireplaces and decorated chambers. It was designed to go on being dangerous after everything around it had failed. A garrison driven back into the keep had lost the castle, but had not yet surrendered. They could hold out for relief. They could negotiate from a position that had not collapsed. They could make the final capture cost more than the attacker wanted to pay. The keep was also a visual anchor for the entire site. Rising above the other structures, it made authority visible from outside the walls. Everything in the castle seemed to lean toward it. All the hierarchy of the place led upward to the place that was hardest to reach. A castle chapel told everyone inside the walls something about the nature of the power they served. Medieval authority did not claim to be purely earthly. It claimed a sanction from above. And the chapel was where that claim was made physical. Lords and ladies heard mass there. Soldiers prayed before danger and gave thanks after survival. Births and deaths and marriages moved through its space. The household marked the Christian calendar in a room that reminded them the castle's authority was embedded in a larger order they were all answerable to. Some chapels were small and spare with a simple altar and plastered walls. Others were richly decorated with carved stone and painted surfaces and coloured glass and metalwork gleaming in candlelight. In either case, the effect was the same. The chapel softened nothing about the hard world outside, but it gave the people living inside it a place where the harshness could be set briefly aside in favour of something that reached beyond stone walls. The Great Hall was where power stopped being abstract and became an experience. A lord ruling from a private room was exercising authority. A lord seated at the high table in a great hall full of his household, and retainers and guests was performing it. Everything in the room was arranged to make the hierarchy visible. Who sat where? Who was served first? What they ate and in what vessels? How close they sat to the lord at the head of the room on his raised dais. Every detail communicated rank, and the room had been built to amplify those details. High roofs threw the voices of musicians up into a space that made music carry. Wall hangings softened the stone and displayed the family's wealth and symbols. Fireplaces provided warmth in graduated amounts depending on how close you sat to the source. The Great Hall was the castle's most public room and therefore its most political one. A guest received there was being shown exactly where they stood in a world where that knowledge shaped every decision they would make afterward. Castle kitchens were engines of social order as much as food. The scale of what they produced during feasts and during emergencies was remarkable. Hundreds of people might need feeding in a great household on a feast day. The butchering and the baking and the brewing and the preserving all had to happen in coordination and in sequence, timed to tables that expected to be served according to rank. The noble table received different food than the servants' table, and the servants' table received different food than the labourers. The kitchen enforced those distinctions silently through what it sent up and what it held back. During sieges, the same kitchen became a rationing system, measuring what remained against the unknown length of the weight. Cooks had to understand fire and timing and preservation, and the expectations of their lord, and the physical limits of what they had been given to work with. Behind the ceremony of the great hall, behind the authority of the keep, was a room full of heat and labour and skill that made all of it possible. Stone walls were cold, and smoke was constant, and comfort was something built in layers. A bare stone chamber in winter was a serious challenge, even for people accustomed to the physical demands of medieval life. The walls radiated chill. Small windows admitted limited light and even more limited warmth. Fire was essential, but in the earlier periods of castle history, the smoke from central hearths drifted upward and gathered under rafters and settled into clothing and tapestries and the hair of everyone who spent time inside. The wealthy added layer upon layer to make their rooms habitable. Tapestries hung against stone reduced the cold transmitted through the walls and absorbed some of the sound that bounced through hard rooms. Rushes on the floor softened footsteps and absorbed moisture and spills, though they also accumulated everything that fell into them over time. Glass windows, where they appeared, were marks of real wealth, transforming a draughty opening into something that held light while excluding the weather. Medieval comfort was not found. It was constructed, carefully, from objects that worked on the body and the imagination simultaneously. Glass windows were expensive enough that their presence in a room announced its occupant's status. In many periods and many places, window openings were covered with shutters or oiled cloth or wooden screens rather than the transparent material we take for granted. A room without glass was dim even in the middle of the day and draughty in any weather that moved. Where glass appeared, it changed the room. Light entered without the wind following it. Colours could be added, turning the window into a source of beauty as well as light. In the finest chapels and chambers, coloured glass might fill the openings with patterns and figures that moved with the sun across the hours of the day. To own glazed windows was to show that you could afford them, and to show that was itself a form of power. A visitor entering a well-lit room with glass on every side understood immediately the resources of whoever had built it. Light became a measure of wealth, and the window that admitted it was as much a display as the tapestry on the wall beside it. Private chambers became more common as castle households grew more sophisticated. The earliest great households conducted much of their life communally. Sleeping and eating and meeting all happened in shared spaces with little separation between ranks. Over time, the highest members of the household began to withdraw. Private rooms allowed lords and ladies to receive select visitors away from the crowd, to conduct sensitive business without an audience, to sleep without a hall full of retainers on the floor around them. The existence of these private chambers changed the meaning of access. To be invited into a lord's private room was a form of favour. To be kept in the great hall was a form of distance. Architecture began to create a geography of intimacy, moving from the most public spaces through a sequence of increasingly restricted rooms toward a private inner sanctum where only the most trusted or most important were admitted. Power organised itself spatially. The further you could go, the more completely you were trusted. The door that could close was itself a kind of authority. Mining beneath castle walls was one of the most feared forms of attack. An enemy who could not break through a wall might go underneath it. Skilled engineers and labourers dug toward the foundation of a tower or wall section, propping the tunnel with timber as they removed the earth that had supported the stonework above. Once enough of the foundation had been undermined, the tunnel was packed with combustible material and set alight. As the timber props burned through, the tunnel failed, and the structure above it could crack and slide and collapse in a way that opened a gap even the strongest walls had not been able to prevent. The work was conducted in darkness in confined spaces with the weight of a castle overhead. Defenders who suspected mining placed drums or bowls of water near the ground and listened for the faint vibrations of digging below them. Some dug countermines to intercept the attackers underground. The battle beneath a castle could be as intense as any fought above it, and was conducted in darkness, silence, and very, close quarters. Timber castles burned too easily for a world that kept using fire as a weapon. A wooden palisade and tower could rise in days and defend effectively against arrows and small assaults. Against fire, it was vulnerable in a completely different way. Burning material carried to the base of a timber wall, fire arrows finding dry wood, a night attack with torches aimed at a gate or roof. Any of these could turn a commanding position into an inferno faster than defenders could respond. Smoke blinded and disoriented. Stored supplies and roofs and walkways could all catch. A strong position could become uninhabitable within an hour. Defenders used wet hides and earth coverings and careful spacing to reduce the risk, but timber always carried that vulnerability, and everyone who lived inside timber walls knew it. The spread of stone construction across medieval Europe was not only about grandeur or permanence, it was about a material that fire could not eat in an afternoon. Stone changed the calculation of attack fundamentally. Burning a stone castle was not impossible, but it was no longer a matter of one well-placed torch. Lime mortar took years to reach its full strength inside a thick wall. The stones that made a castle visible were only part of what held it together. Between them was mortar, and mortar was alive in ways that builders understood through experience rather than chemistry. Lime burned from limestone and mixed with water and aggregate hardened by reacting with the air around it. The surface could set quickly while the deep interior of a very thick wall continued the same slow process for years after the scaffolding came down. A castle that looked complete and strong might still have interior mortar that had not yet reached its full hardness. Builders knew this. They built with the knowledge that their material was still becoming what they needed it to be. A castle wall was not finished on the day the last stone was placed. It was finished gradually, invisibly inside the thickness of the masonry where no one could see it happening. The wall that seemed so solid was still quietly changing long after the builders had moved on to the next commission. Castles near borders accumulated the history of every conflict that touched them. A fortress on a frontier was never simply a military installation. It was a declaration about which side of a disputed line controlled the land it stood on. When that control was contested, the castle became a prize and a symbol and a target simultaneously. It might be attacked and retaken and repaired and attacked again across decades, without its walls ever permanently reflecting a single owner. The people living nearby experienced this not as history, but as a recurring condition. A child growing up in the shadow of a border castle might hear stories of a siege their parents remembered and witness another one before they were old. Border castles accumulated layers of damage and repair and adaptation that made them architecturally uneven in ways that told the story of every conflict better than any document written about them. Every patched section was an argument. Every new tower was an answer. The castle on a frontier was never finished, because the question it existed to answer was never finally settled. A license to crenellate was royal permission to add battlements, and it meant more than stone. In medieval England, adding defensive features to a residence required approval from the crown. Fortification was not a purely personal decision. It involved royal authority because a lord who built walls and towers was assembling something that looked very much like a power base. The crown managed this by making the act of fortifying a formal acknowledgement of the king's supremacy. A license was granted as a favour. Its recipient was grateful and publicly so. The battlements that resulted were not simply stone, they were evidence of a relationship with royal power. For many nobles, the license mattered as much as the battlements themselves, because it was visible proof of standing. Neighbours who arrived to find a newly crenellated manor understood that the owner had the king's ear. That was sometimes more useful than the fortifications, and required considerably less expense to maintain. Castle building was political theatre conducted over years in full view of everyone nearby. A lord who began building a castle was announcing himself to the region in the most expensive and visible way available to him: the quarrying of stone. The arrival of skilled workers from other regions, the digging of ditches, and the rising of walls. All of it was public. All of it was intended to be public. The neighbours watched. The tenants watched, the rivals watched. And what they watched was a version of the world being constructed in stone that claimed this lord was powerful enough to undertake such a project and connected enough to see it through. Once complete, the castle continued the performance. Its gates received visitors with calculated ceremony, its towers displayed banners, its great hall staged the rituals of hospitality and justice before audiences that included exactly the people who most needed to understand the message. A castle was never neutral. To build one was to make a claim, and the claim was made slowly, expensively, and in stone, so that everyone who passed beneath it would find it very difficult to argue with. Heraldic display turned castle architecture into a family argument about legitimacy. Coats of arms carved above gates, or painted on walls, or displayed on banners were not decoration in the way we might use the word today. They were evidence. They showed who held the castle, and what rights that holding implied, and what lineage lay behind the family name. In a world where identity could be disputed and inheritance could be challenged in court or on the battlefield, making your family's symbols visible was a form of legal assertion. A newly built castle draped in the heraldic colours of an ancient family was claiming continuity, claiming deep roots, claiming that the power it exercised was not recent or accidental, but descended through proper lines from proper ancestors. Visitors who recognised the symbols understood the claim without a word being spoken. Those who did not recognise them were being educated. Either way, the castle's walls were doing the talking before anyone inside them had opened their mouths. Siege warfare was slower and more calculated than popular imagination allows. The image of ladders going up and men streaming over walls is dramatic, but it represents a last resort that both sides usually preferred to avoid. A commander besieging a castle thought first about supplies and seasons, and the likelihood of relief forces arriving from outside. He thought about whether hunger or disease might do what his siege engines could not. He thought about the morale of the garrison, and whether it might be broken by a well-placed message as readily as by a direct assault. The defenders thought about all the same things from the other side. How long could they hold? What would the terms be if they negotiated now versus what they might be forced to accept later? Whether the relief they were hoping for was actually coming. Both sides understood that a wall could be standing and a garrison could still collapse because the calculations of endurance had finally come out the wrong way. Sieges were contests of arithmetic as much as force. Prisoners inside a castle could be worth more alive than any treasure stored there. A captured knight or lord represented a specific financial claim. He would be housed appropriately for his rank, fed decently, perhaps allowed correspondence, and held until his family paid a ransom that reflected his importance. Humiliating a valuable prisoner was counterproductive. It stored up a debt of vengeance that would eventually need paying, and it reduced his family's willingness to negotiate in good faith. Treatment that acknowledged rank made the whole transaction go more smoothly, and might even leave the prisoner with a complicated kind of gratitude toward his captor. The castle suited this arrangement because it provided secure rooms at varying levels of comfort, and the infrastructure to maintain a prisoner in the appropriate style for as long as negotiations required. Some of history's most interesting medieval correspondences were written from prison chambers in castles where the writer had time, parchment, and considerable motivation to be eloquent about what his release was worth. Many castle garrisons were much smaller than the buildings they defended might suggest. A large fortress does not necessarily require large numbers of people to remain dangerous. The design of a well-built castle multiplied the effectiveness of each defender. A narrow stair could be held by one person at a time. A gate could be controlled by a handful. A wall walk could be patrolled in turns. The architecture itself reduced the number of bodies needed to maintain basic defensive readiness. In peacetime, many castles were maintained by officials, watchmen, and servants rather than by soldiers in any significant number. When danger approached, reinforcements could be called in from the surrounding area. The smallest garrison capable of deterring attack was the most economical, and medieval lords understood economics very clearly. They did not maintain armies in their castles out of preference. They maintained enough people to keep the castle credible and trusted the walls to do the rest. Castle servants kept the whole system running and received almost no recognition for doing so. The person who carried water before dawn, the person who swept the great hall after the remains of a feast, the person who tended fires and aired bedding and maintained the stores and repaired the kind of small damage that accumulates in any large building across a day of continuous use. None of these people appear in the chronicles that recorded battles and inheritances, but without them, the castle that those chronicles celebrated would have been cold and dirty and eventually uninhabitable within a few weeks. The military and political power of a great fortress rested entirely on the invisible labour of people whose names were not considered worth writing down. They moved through the building at hours when its important occupants were asleep. They knew the castle's routines better than any soldier or official. They kept it alive, and the stories we tell about it belong as much to them as to anyone who ever rode through its gates. Gunpowder did not destroy the castle immediately, but it began asking questions the old designs could not answer. The arrival of effective cannon changed what strength meant in fortification. Tall walls that had resisted ladders and trebuchets for centuries were well suited to the threats they had been designed against. Against heavy artillery, they presented large targets at convenient heights. The concentrated impact of cannon fire could crack masonry in ways that differed fundamentally from the scattered battering of earlier siege methods. Defenders began to need walls that were lower and thicker and angled to deflect or absorb impact rather than simply resist it through mass. The transition took time. Cannon were expensive and unreliable, and uneven in their development across different regions and different wars. Some older castles were adapted with gun ports cut through existing walls and earthworks added to protect vulnerable sections. Others simply became less useful, as the weapons available to their enemies outgrew the assumptions their builders had made when they chose the height of those towers. Some castles were never attacked at all, and that was the point. A fortress that prevented conflict by existing did its job as completely as one that repelled a siege. The enemy who looked at the walls and the garrison and the position and chose a different target had been defeated without a single weapon being raised. This kind of success leaves no dramatic record. No chronicle entry describes the attack that did not happen. No account records the army that turned away without engaging. The castle that discouraged its enemies through sheer credibility appears in the historical record as quiet and uneventful, while the castles that were actually attacked have left us stories. But peace around a fortress was not proof of irrelevance. It may have been proof of effectiveness. The arrows that were never loosed, and the ladders that were never raised, and the siege that was never begun are part of the castle's history too. Readiness that was never tested was still readiness. A castle's shadow reached far beyond its walls into the economy of everything around it. It consumed food and fuel and ironwork and timber and leather and cloth in quantities that shaped the markets of the surrounding region. Farmers found buyers for their produce, but also faced obligations and dues. Craftsmen had steady work repairing and supplying, but answered to lordly authority. Roads improved because the castle required reliable movement of supplies. Markets developed because concentrated demand attracted concentrated supply. The fortress was a node around which economic life organised itself, whether that organisation was voluntary or compelled, or some combination of both. Local communities experienced the castle as a daily economic fact as much as a political or military one. It shaped what they grew and what they made and where they sold and whom they paid. The walls enclosed a household that was always hungry for what the surrounding land could provide, and that hunger moved through the landscape in the form of obligation and opportunity long before it reached the kitchens inside the gate. Ruined castles survived often because they were simply too difficult to dismantle. An abandoned fortress was frequently treated as a convenient quarry. Cut stone was valuable, and if it could be carried away it usually was, repurposed into farmhouses and boundary walls and churches and roads by communities that had no particular interest in preserving historical monuments. What survived was often what proved too heavy or too awkward or too expensive to move. Massive walls with strong mortar resisted the effort. High positions made removal costly, And so the ruins we stand before today may owe their existence not to conscious preservation, but to the limits of medieval and early modern labour. Over time the ruins acquired new meaning. They became romantic. They became historical. They became the objects of antiquarian interest and eventually of formal protection. But that later care came after centuries of accidental survival that depended on the same quality that had made the castle formidable to begin with. Its stonework was very difficult to overcome. Archaeology beneath a ruined castle reveals the life that the standing walls have forgotten. A ruin that appears to be empty and legible above ground may contain an entirely different story below the surface. Beneath grass and rubble and the collapsed remains of demolished ranges lie foundations and drainage systems and hearths and pathways, and the dense archaeological layer of centuries of continuous occupation. A shallow depression that looks like nothing in particular may be the only surface trace of a building that was once the most active part of the site. Fragments of pottery can show where trade connections reached. Animal bone can show what different ranks of the household ate. Charcoal can identify where cooking happened and what wood was burned to do it. Soil samples can reveal what grew in the garden against the south-facing wall. The castle that the visitor photographs from outside is a very partial version of the place that archaeology has access to. The most interesting parts of many medieval fortresses are waiting quietly under the feet of the people walking above them. And so we come gently to the end of our time inside these extraordinary places. We have walked through gates built to make the confident feel exposed. We have climbed stairs designed to give the advantage to the person at the top. We have looked down into wells that went deeper than the towers above them, and up at walls that were still hardening inside long after the builders had gone. We have seen the lord in the great hall, and the cook at the fire, and the servant before dawn with the water, and the soldier on the wall in the dark. We have understood that a castle was never simply a building. It was a system of power and labour and calculation and daily life that shaped everything within sight of it. Only fragments remain in most places now. A wall standing in a field, an arch over an empty doorway, a stair that climbs to open sky, but even those fragments still hold something, a stillness that feels like memory, a weight that speaks of all the human intention that went into placing each stone in precisely that position for precisely that reason. If this quiet journey through the medieval world brought you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment there is nothing more to follow. Let the great walls fade back into the hillside. Let the torches go out one by one. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. The castle has kept its watch long enough for one night. The gate is closing softly. The stones are settling into silence. And you can rest now. Sleep well. Good night.